It seems every year, right around this time, between Martin Luther King Day and the beginning of Black History Month, you always hear about people trying to insist that Martin Luther King would be one thing or would be another thing if he was alive today, oftentimes forgetting the actual words of Martin Luther King. Some years we hear that Martin Luther King would supposedly be part of the neo-Confederate Republican Party of today if he were alive. Other years, it's crimes of omission. You hear Martin Luther King's 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech, but you don't hear on TV or in the media, you don't hear mentioned what he said in his 1967 Riverside Church speech. Well, the Pentagon, as it always often does, is topping everybody. The biggest of big government departments is now claiming that Martin Luther King, if he was alive today, he would support more defense spending, more weapons procurement, and more militarism in general. If you think I'm making this up, think again. To celebrate Martin Luther King Day, the Air Force, on its website, put up an essay arguing that it was paying tribute to Martin Luther King and arguing in that supposed tribute that Martin Luther King would support, again, more militarism and more defense spending. Here's what happened. The Air Force's website for its global strike team put up an essay on Martin Luther King Day saying this, quote, "Dr. King would be proud to see our global strike team ensuring the most powerful weapons in the United States arsenal remain the credible bedrock of our national defense. Maintaining our commitment to our global strike team, our families, and our nation is a fitting tribute to Dr. King as we celebrate his legacy." That was the Air Force. The Marines followed that up with a post on its Twitter feed, quoting a Martin Luther King quote in a not-so-subtle effort to claim that the civil rights leader, the most famous orator and proponent of nonviolence, claiming that he would probably support the Marines in their war-making operations. They put up on their Twitter feed a quote from Dr. King in which he said, quote, "A man who won't die for something is not fit to live." Now, Dr. King did say that, but he did not say that as a way to support the missions of the United States Marines. Now, this was a follow-up from last year, 2011, in which the Defense Department put on its website a story with the headline, quote, "King might understand today's wars, Pentagon lawyer says." So Dr. King, apparently, according to the Pentagon, according to your government, according to your U.S. Defense Department, Dr. King would support more defense spending, more weapons spending, and more wars, or at least the current wars that we're fighting right now. Is this true? Or is this what Cornel West has called the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King? I think the record is pretty obvious. I mentioned that 1967 Riverside Church speech from Martin Luther King. I encourage everybody who's watching this to go actually listen to it, watch it, or read an entire transcript of it. It's one of the most important speeches I think ever given in U.S. history. And here are some key excerpts of it, just to put it in contrast to what you just heard the Pentagon say about Martin Luther King. Here's one quote from that speech. "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." The same speech, another quote, quote, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government." Another quote from Martin Luther King, quote, "There's nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war." So this is, I think quite obviously, an effort to Santa Clausify Martin Luther King. And Glenn Greenwald at The Guardian, who first reported on this, put it, I think, exactly right. He said this, quote, "The U.S. military is actually publicly claiming that the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize winner and steadfast critic of U.S. imperialism would be an admirer of its massive stockpile of nuclear weapons, its global assassination programs, and its covert use of violence in multiple countries around the world, including where no wars are declared. Merely to describe this agitprop is to illustrate its repulsiveness." And I completely agree with Glenn, except for one additional point that I think is worth making. It is repulsive. Taking the legacy, taking the record, taking the words of Martin Luther King, which were very explicit, There's not a lot of wiggle room in the Riverside Church speech to claim that Martin Luther King would support more militarism and defense speech. Taking those words and using the image of Dr. King to pretend that he would support a larger Pentagon and more wars is repulsive. But in a political world where lies often show a level of desperation, there is something encouraging here. And that is that the Pentagon seems to realize big shifts in public opinion. The Pentagon is clearly in the business right now, when it comes to Dr. King, of desperate lies. To say that Dr. King would support more militarism, defense spending, and weapons, that is a desperate, demonstrably false lie. There's no wiggle room there. And so in so brazenly lying, the Pentagon is showing that it is more and more desperate to prevent more and more Americans from appreciating the spirit of what Dr. King was saying. The Pentagon essentially sees public opinion polls that show that more and more Americans don't want us to be spending as much money on defense as we're spending, don't want militarism to be the central organizing political factor in American political life. More and more Americans, in other words, are actually coming to the same kinds of realization that Dr. King came to in that 1967 speech. And so in response, the Pentagon is getting desperate. They're lying about one of the most revered, one of the most honored, one of the most respected leaders in American history. Now, that doesn't excuse the propaganda. I'm not saying it's great that the military brass is deciding to lie about Dr. King. What I'm saying, though, is that the desperation reflects a welcome, granted slow, but welcome change in American public opinion. The Pentagon is trying to fight that change, but they are increasingly fighting a losing battle.